Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Jabanto Honey Processed Ethiopia from Proud Mary Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And as they say, Melbourne born and Portland made. So Proud Mary initially out of Melbourne, but this is based out of Portland, Oregon. As for anybody from Australia that might not know, there is a Proud Mary cafe out in Portland, and it's a cafe that I quite actually enjoy, as they've always had one of the more impressive coffee selections I've seen from any coffee roaster in the entire world. So yeah, they're a coffee roaster that I have a lot of familiarity with. I've spent a lot of time out in Portland, so I've had an opportunity to visit their cafe for a very long time, but this is our first time reviewing a full bag of their coffee, and I'm looking forward to finally discussing their coffee. This right here is day 30? Day 30 of this coffee. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 208 degrees Fahrenheit through the Chemex or V60, about equal parts good in both of those brew methods. And it is probably on the lighter side of American coffees, as this was a really light coffee, so we'll call it a light American for the roast profile, even if it is originally Australian. But with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. So day 18, which was the first time I got it, first time I tried it, and it was a pretty strong black tea on the forefront, and then there was a fair bit of this nuttiness. Now I know when there's a lot of this stone fruit, it reminds me a lot of nuttiness as well. They're kind of really similar in the flavor sense to me for those two specific things, but I would often describe it as the apricot-like stone fruit, and the coffee gets better as it cools down, and was feeling a pretty heavy bit of vanilla. I really should have looked at that note more often, because I definitely get a lot of vanilla in this coffee now too. Light and delicate flavor overall, and that's not too unusual from what I've experienced from so many of Proud Mary's previous coffees. Typically when I go down to their cafe, that's what I find from their coffees. As I say, they just kind of feel a little lighter and tame as a whole in terms of a flavor profile. So that was my first impression, not too surprising. Day 19 ran into the Chemex, and the profile was a little bit more clear in this sense. It's a quintessential washed Ethiopia, even though it's a honey processed Ethiopia, as it had so many of those characteristics, including it being, well, very kind of clean, sharp, and lighter overall. But yeah, it was just basically a better day on this moment. It still had so many of those same characteristics, and that's going to be a theme, is it's a pretty consistent cup of coffee in that sense. A little bit of black tea, grab it of stone fruits, let's keep going. Day 21 up to temperatures, ran it to the Chemex, and was seeing some similarities to some Fried Hats coffees, as it had a very interesting kind of slight caramel sweetness to it. Continues to demonstrate those lighter washed Gucci characteristics, and it's just kind of been hard to highlight or emphasize any other points in this coffee to this point, and even past this, because it was a very straightforward cup of coffee. There wasn't too much outside of the traditional things you were expecting or getting from this cup of coffee, but even then, it was just making for a pretty nice cup of coffee as a whole. That's when I decided to up the ratio, and they do have listed on their brew guides typically, or their instruction cards I should say, that they like higher ratios, and I did go with the higher ratio, and it makes a lot of sense why this coffee had been a little light in terms of flavor and profile as a whole, but this was a standout day of this coffee. Thought it was a pretty wonderful cup, very deep and heavy stone fruits with plenty of candy-like sweetness, and almost a bit more of this kind of strong washed Gucci-like cup. So a lot of those stone fruits, and these were a little bit more vibrant of a sense, and that's not too surprising. This is a honey processed coffee. I believe it's a Sidama. So even then, just a little different, but at the same time, it still reminded me way more of drinking a washed Ethiopia. If you asked me what I was drinking, I would assume I was drinking probably a washed Ethiopia. Day 27, let it sit for a little bit, and it was not quite as vibrant on this day, but still a very kind of Gucci-like cup of coffee. Slight bit of that savory black tea-like components with a slight bit of still this candy sweetness. Not as good, but still quite nice overall. So still enjoying this cup of coffee. And day 29, which was the final day, one more day through the Chemex, and the coffee has been pretty consistent no matter how it was brewed. I feel like I'm not necessarily providing too much outside of the box on this coffee, but that's because this coffee, again, was pretty straightforward. Sweetness, slight yet distinct, a little bit more vibrant version of that Gucci still. Nothing much to add. Haven't seen any of the drop off, which I guess is a pretty important note, as coffee has been pretty consistent over the course of the now 12 days that we've been drinking it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And a lot of level 4s, nothing too surprising on those, but let's run through them real quick. Cleanliness, level 4, I mean, we'll call that really good considering it is a honey processed coffee, but throughout the entire time drinking this coffee, it's been a pretty clean cup of coffee, so that's always going to be nice. Finish, yeah, you know, even for it being a little bit more slightly lighter and a little bit more tame coffee, I still think that it has a pretty nice and lasting finish, so finish is definitely justified at the level 4. And throughout the time drinking, it was a little bit more of an acidic cup of coffee. I think that might be a little high at the 4, but probably 3 to 4, maybe on the lower side of the 4. Still seems pretty decent. And then the stone fruits, of course, they're not like blowing you away, and they're way more akin to apricot as opposed to peach, which I love the peach way more than I like the apricot, so that's worth noting. Saltiness up there, mentioned that apricot sometimes reminds me a lot of some nuttiness, so that's why the saltiness is as high as it is. The sweetness at level 3, mentioned that's a little bit more tame, so it's not the sweetest cup of coffee, but even then, I think the sweetness in this cup is just overall pretty nice. A little bit of candy-like sweetness. From time to time, it can remind me of maybe some like candy apricot, some apricot-like candy. Anything else worth noting? Lighter body. I mean, I think when you look at this tasting wheel, it honestly looks way more like a wash-processed Ethiopia than a honey-processed Ethiopia, but florals at level 3, yeah, I mean, I just should say there was a fair bit of florals in this, maybe some slight floral honey to it. Alright, overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I mean, I love washed Guji, so I guess it's not too surprising that I really like this coffee. This is, as my first ever full bag of Proud Mary's coffees. I've only ever purchased individual cups from them at their cafe. I thought this was kind of nice. And I think in the future, I'm probably going to try something that maybe is a little bit more on their wild side. This is in the middle of their spectrum. They call it curious, so it's supposed to be just a slight bit more of a, we would even say, normal cup of coffee as opposed to something that's a little out there. Because I've had so many cups of coffee from them that are wildly out there. This one's very much inside of a box, and I think it's a good thing because I was never going to be disappointed by this coffee. I always say that it's hard to review Ethiopia's because there's only so much you can get from it. But I think they did a nice job on this coffee. And I would definitely go back and purchase another bag of their coffee, hopefully sometime in the near future. And again, something maybe a little bit more out there. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though. I mean, if you love washed Gujis like a lot of people do, but you like a little bit more of that apricot kind, then keep that in mind, as I think that this still did have a nice bit more sweetness, even if it was a little different sweetness than that peach sweetness that comes from Gujis. But it had that same sort of clarity and finish as well. So a little bit of that slight black tea, but at the same time, a wonderful bit of stone fruits to complement that, making it for a pretty nice, well-rounded cup of coffee. I think I'm going to leave this review at that, though. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well as if you've had any cups of coffee from Proud Mary, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of them. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Jabanto honey processed Ethiopia from Proud Mary Coffee. Thank you for watching.